We are so honored to have Amelia Pang on. She is the author of Made in China, A Prisoner, an SOS Letter, and The Hidden Cost of America's Cheap Goods. She's an award-winning investigative journalist of Uyghur and Chinese descent. Her work has been published in the New Republic, Mother Jones, and the New York Times, Sunday Review, among many other platforms. Amelia, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, I want to kind of take a step back and just get to just what's been happening with the Chinese government and the Uyghur population. I think there's been a lot of misinformation, probably strategically so, put out there, propaganda, I would even say, to confuse folks. But this is your dissent. I ask you, somebody from the community, to explain like what's been going on and why is it not more well known in the States?
Well, the rise of the concentration camps that are detaining Uyghurs in China today is closely tied with China's Belt and Road Initiative, which is a $1 trillion economic development strategy. It's this infrastructure project that connects China to the Middle East, connects China to Europe and West Asia. It's extremely China has put a lot of investments in this project, and it's kind of too big to fail. And where the Uyghurs live, the Uyghur region, also known as Xinjiang, that is in Western China and Central Asia. So the Belt and Road, a key part of the Belt and Road, goes through that area. So based on the history of the Chinese government's relationship with the Uyghurs, which hasn't been a good one because Uyghurs and other Turkic people in China are basically living as second-class citizens. It's hard for them to get jobs. If they go to a hotel and try to book a hotel, they might get turned away because they're not Han Chinese. These are things that are a common experience for Uyghurs in China. So the Chinese government is afraid of an uprising in the region, and there hasn't been any large-scale uprisings that could actually disrupt the Belt and Road Initiative. But because of that fear, the Chinese government started rounding up millions of Uyghurs into camps since 2016, 2017, which is really when you saw investments in the Belt and Road Initiative ramp up.
Okay, so let's just be very clear. So the Uyghur population, they overlap with the location of this initiative, like where they're expanding their investments. Is that correct?
Yes, absolutely. A turning point in terms of the spike of the camps happened in 2017 when China invested $66 billion in the infrastructure of that region for the Belt and Road Initiative.
And what does the Belt and Road Initiative do? What is their goal? Is it natural resources?
It's building these China-funded bridges, like 5G networks and other major infrastructure projects. That region serves as a major transportation hub for the Belt and Road Initiative. So it's a huge logistical importance to China.
And when you say, okay, so the infrastructure is for trade purposes. So if there are natural resource exploration in other areas of the East, this is a region of transport solely.
Yes, it's a huge logistical importance. So that's why, if we have companies pulling out of that region, a region that China has made a lot of investment into setting up as an economic hub, then that could lead to some meaningful changes in terms of closing the camps.
Okay, so let's rewind just a little bit so we understand how these camps operate. When did the Chinese government start to crack down? Was it prior to this investment? Were there protests? How did this all originate?
There were some small-scale protests in a few years ago. There was a knife attack at one of the popular train stations that led to one of the crackdowns. But there hasn't been any evidence that there would be any large-scale protests that could disrupt their economic investments.
So this is just all to make sure there's absolutely no, why the Uyghur population? I mean, if there's no protests and they can go about business and continue to invest in infrastructure, why are they creating camps? Is there some other sort of nationalistic goal?
Yes, well, the goal is to have all populations in China, whether you're Tibetan, whether you're Uyghur, whether you're Kazakh, identify closely with the Chinese government, which means having a uniform identity and
Mhm.
cutting ties with your own culture and your heritage, unfortunately.
Mhm. And how successful has that been?
Through coercion, it has unfortunately been very successful. I mean, my own family tells that story. My grandmother was half Uyghur. She grew up in
Mhm.
that part of the homeland and knew the culture, knew the language. But within just one generation, that was mostly lost. My family and my cousins to this day cannot speak the Uyghur language.
Wow.
We just don't have a connection with that part of our heritage.
And how large is the population? The Uyghur population in particular?
The latest, I don't have the latest numbers, but there's currently at least 1 million of Uyghurs in
Mhm.
camps.
So in terms of these camps, what are the circumstances?
Well, you have to take a step back and look at the history of these camps. They've existed since the start of the Chinese Communist Party in the 40s. Um, Initially, they were based off of Soviet gulags. The intent for these camps was to target political dissidents, class enemies, and these people were kept alive to serve as a source of free labor for the
Mhm.
Chinese economy. And with each expansion of economic growth, there's been an expansion of camps. Uh, it used to be that these camps primarily targeted political dissidents, rights defenders.
Mhm.
A lot of the student protesters from the 1989 Tiananmen Square protests ended up in these camps
Hmm.
doing free labor for the global economy. And in recent years, we're seeing the latest iteration of these camps, the darkest iteration of these camps, which are the ones targeting Uyghurs and other Turkic people. And the intent behind these camps is really to destroy an entire ethnic group.
That's the sole intention, is just to destroy them entirely.
Based on the policies that we're seeing, yes.
And what type of international response has there been?
You're starting to see some strong international response. The US government recently passed the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, which would ban all goods from the Uyghur region from being imported into the US. And that's a pretty meaningful act to sign into law because, again, any way that we could hurt the financial investment that the Chinese government has made in the region really sends a strong message to convince them to lessen lessen their hold on the camps. But it remains to be seen how well that can be enforced. There's a lot that our corporations can do. They can do better to track whether their products are being made in these camps. And the way that corporate audits are currently done are pretty
Mm.
weak in terms of detecting forced labor.
Okay, we're gonna get to your story in a second because it's shocking. But what do you mean by that in terms of like the auditing of the supply chain auditing, or is it much more than that?
Yes, during my research for this book, I was shocked to find that the way that audits are designed, they're not really designed to detect forced labor at that factory. They're not designed to detect if that factory has a secret subcontracting relationship with nearby prison camps. There's a lot that corporations can do to find out this information, but they're not looking because nobody is really asking them to. Consumers are not demanding them to. It's not hurting their bottom line to continue sourcing from these types of forced labor facilities.
Wait, hang on, just to be clear. So a company, say like Apple, I'll just say Apple, right? So Apple hires so and so company uh to produce its product, to assemble its product. Just making this up. There's no truth. This is just my example. The company is in charge of assembling it might have a subcontractor that Apple is not aware of, that might be forced labor. Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely. It's so funny you mentioned Apple because I actually went to China in early 2019 to visit these camps and follow the trucks that left these facilities to see which exporters they were working with. And they were working with an official Apple supplier. The address came up on Apple's official supply chain list. And when I reached out to Apple to ask what they were doing to discourage this factory from having a relationship with the forced labor facility, what kind of audits they conducted to detect this kind of information. They basically refused to give me any information, and to this day, the supplier remains one of their suppliers.
Interesting. So what companies are working in this region that you're aware of?
Well, so many. A great resource is the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. In early 2020, they released a pretty damning report that found 82 major global brands sourcing from factories that are known to be using Uyghur forced labor. And although this report came out a while ago in March 2020, not a whole lot has changed. Nike, for example, continues to use that supplier, even though there's hard evidence that that factory built a re-education night school for Uyghurs into that facility. Nike said that they've conducted audits and they don't believe there are any Uyghurs there anymore. But they've released no information about what kind of an audit they conducted to confirm there's no forced labor there. And I think that's something that needs to change.
Oh my goodness. So, you know, the story that you tell, and this is heartbreaking. In your book, you mentioned in 2012, an Oregon mother named Julie Keith opened up a package of Halloween decorations, and it basically changed her life. Can you explain what happened?
Right. The book opens up in October 2012 when this ordinary suburban mom is looking for Halloween decorations for her kid's party. As she goes through her storage shed, looking at all the decorations she's collected over the years, she comes across this unopened package of styrofoam gravestones that someone had gifted to her 2 years ago. It was one of those impulse purchases that someone had gotten from Kmart for no other reason other than the fact that it was really, really cheap. It was on clearance sale. But nobody had a need for it. It sat in storage for 2 years before she remembered to open it, and she was shocked to find an SOS letter had been waiting for the whole time. It was written by the forced labor in China who had made and packaged this very product in a very gruesome labor camp. The letter talked about how he was tortured, he was starved, he and the other forced laborers had to work 15 hours a day, 7 days a week, and they were paid less than $2 a month for all of this work. So my book aims to explore who are these types of forced laborers that land in this camp? Who is the author of this SOS letter? What were their experiences in the camps? What kind of products they manufactured? And more importantly, what are the loopholes in the way that our corporations try to make sure that they're doing sustainable sourcing? What are the loopholes that make it so easy for products manufactured in a gruesome labor camp to end up selling at a store like a Kmart in Portland, Oregon?
So what are some of these loopholes? How are they able to get away with this? I mean, I remember years ago, I was, I mean, literally 25 years ago, I was in college, and I was in some political science class. It was like a 201 level or something, and this lawyer came in and spoke to us, and he was the lawyer in the case against, you might recall, Kathy Lee Gifford had she had like a workout line or clothing line for Kmart, I believe, if I'm correct. And she had been caught saying her goods were made in the USA, but it was really in territories. And when the loophole there was that, well, yes, it was made in the USA, but the territories did not have to follow the same standards that you have to in the United States, which of course are becoming worse and worse over the years. And this lawyer had effectively represented the workers, you know, 25 years ago. And at this point, maybe it was 30 years ago because he spoke to us 25 years ago. And I remember my entire worldview being shifted as a, 19-year-old college student thinking this could happen. Like, what? There's a loophole. You go to the territories, you can get away with this. But this seems much darker and more complicated. And it seems like the industry has become much more sophisticated. So what loopholes did you find?
Well, historically, factory audits were mostly designed to protect the corporation rather than the worker. So when you have when the company receives bad press, like, hey, this factory is known to be using forced labor and they're in your supply chain, they can say, hey, we conducted an audit. It was an independent audit. We had a third-party audit. It was a great audit, and it confirmed that there's no forced labor in the supply chain and this information is wrong. It kind of protects the corporation, but rarely do these audits actually look into the things that you would need to look at to detect forced labor. For example, a standard audit that costs a couple $100 is usually a pretty cursory one that would only look for things like the cleanliness of the factory, how well the equipment is made, quality of the merchandise. It can't really detect something as complex as forced labor, especially if it's hidden through subcontractors. There's more comprehensive comprehensive and expensive audits called social compliance audits. They do take a deeper look at the wage documents and the factory's working conditions to make sure they're paying their workers well, and they're really subcontracting to where they're saying they're subcontracting to. But even social compliance auditors have told me it's really, really hard and maybe impossible for them to detect some of these more secret subcontracts to prison camps. They know that it's happening, but they can't really prove it based on what they're required to look for in the audits. So audits are often pretty limited in scope. But if companies start changing one or two things about what they look for in the audits, like let's say just saying that you write in the contract that you may send someone to follow the trucks that leave your facility to see if you're working with any prison camps nearby. That can send a very strong message to the Chinese suppliers saying, hey, they're taking this issue seriously. We're not going to work with prisons for this reason. And that could have a meaningful effect in terms of making the forced labor system less lucrative for the Chinese government. But since none of the Western brands that are sourcing from China are willing to do this, then it continues to be a hidden and very lucrative system.
Okay, so the part that I don't really understand is, okay, so the audit is done by, it's U.S. audits over U.S. companies, right?
Right.
Okay, and then they subcontract to what I would assume is Chinese-based companies.
Well, a lot of the suppliers have subcontractors to other factories.
So say like Apple has a contract with the suppliers who are based in China. That's how it works?
Yeah.
Okay. And then because they're Chinese companies, you don't necessarily have to audit their finances as U.S. government. It becomes more complicated. But on top of it, like the workers' camps, if these contractors are subcontracting to workers' camps and the workers' camps are being operated by the Chinese government, this is essentially you're paying the Chinese government for free labor. And I mean, is the Chinese government making money off of this labor force that they're trying to essentially, keep out of keep out of protest or whatever their goal is?
Yes, they're absolutely making money. These people are paid significantly less than the local minimum wage, usually, if they're paid at all. They're a very lucrative source of free labor.
For the Chinese government?
Mm-hmm.
Does the Chinese government need it?
No, but if they're going to be silencing and arresting these people anyway, they from their point of view, they might as well make them work. So all kinds of detention centers, whether it's an official prison wherein somebody has received a sentence, or even a drug detox center or a pretrial detention center. There's so many different types of detention centers in China. They all contain manufacturing facilities, and they all have relationships with a lot of exporters.
So in terms of the oversight from the U.S. government, and we're talking about the IRS is doing the audits, or is it others that are doing the audits?
Actually, it's auditing companies that do the audits. So they could be based in Hong Kong, but they probably they do quality audits if you pay for certain kinds of audits to be done.
So the company has to decide whether or not to do it. It's not some sort of like, okay, got it.
Yes.
Right now, in terms of crackdown and pushback, other than the UN, what is the US is? I mean, China has become a significant. I don't know if adversary is the right word, but at least under the Trump administration, they were adversaries. But now under the Biden administration, he's obviously called out China extensively. But what's to be done? Is there a real? I mean, Nancy Pelosi has throughout the last 30 years been very, thoughtful, and she's not perfect, but thoughtful about the human rights situation in China. Does that mean that there's something that's going to happen?
I think under the Biden administration, actually a lot got done. They passed the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, which was a really big deal. It bans all products that are likely made by forced labor from that region, a region with very high risk of forced labor, from coming into the U.S. That was a meaningful piece of legislation, but I think it's not enough to do that because enforcement is hard. What's lacking is corporate accountability. A lot of companies, like Nike, for example, on their website, they say they don't directly source their cotton or raw materials. So which essentially is saying because they don't know where their cotton comes from, it could be coming from Xinjiang, a region with a very high risk of forced labor. But they're not tracking it, and nobody is really making them track it.
And so what's next? What could be done?
I think in addition to all of the policy changes that are happening, we also need consumers to step up and look into your favorite brands that you enjoy shopping from. My book, Made in China, is about ultimately about the small actionable steps that the average consumer can take to move the needle and push our favorite brands to do better in terms of deterring our factories from using forced labor. Start by going to your favorite brand's website and see what kind of a statement they've made about the Uyghurs and about Xinjiang. See if they're willing to say they know where their raw materials are coming from and they're not using forced labor. A lot of companies aren't quite willing to reveal that level of detail, which I think is a part of the problem. You don't know where they're sourcing from. You don't know what they're doing to make sure they're not using forced labor. And that means there's no accountability.
Do you have a list of like a, dirty list of bad actors for consumers to at least be aware of?
I was just looking at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute's list of 82 companies that were found using Uyghur forced labor. This is based on a lot of hard evidence, including the domestic Chinese media reports that documented the workers in these programs and showed them on TV. So I would say that's a good resource for.
We'll put that in the information. Amelia, fascinating, super interesting, and thank you so much for sharing so much about the situation with the Uyghur population and just how intertwined it is with our lives on a daily basis, and what can be done. Check out Amelia's book. It is out right now. It's called Made in China, A Prisoner, an SOS Letter, and the Hidden Cost of America's Cheap Goods. She, of course, is a reporter, and she's appeared in places like the New York Times and so many other places like the New Republic and Mother Jones. Thank you so much for joining us. Go check out our book. As it says, well-researched, and let's put that quote back up there so you can read it. Sorry, David. Well-researched and reported book that reads like a detective story. That's my favorite, detective stories. So great job.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for joining us today, and take care.